Hi everyone, I'm Karthik. I'm also an iSTEM member and I work for Microsoft in the US.
Awesome. So before we get started, we kind of want to give you a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. Briefly, we'll be talking about business case for accessibility, business case for hiring. These are the main things that we'll be talking about. And we want to present why it is important for you to kind of keep accessibility and inclusion, more than accessibility, inclusion in mind for your businesses. So before we go ahead, we'd like to show a quick video.
So just to add, this is the agenda for the presentation. So we have an introduction, that's what Venkatesh spoke about. That's the video, we'll start off with the video. And then we'll talk about the business case for accessibility from the perspective of innovation, branding, and the legal perspectives. We then look at the business case for hiring. And finally, we see what is it that we need to do in terms of concrete actions to move towards inclusion and accessibility. Okay? So moving on to the video, just give me a minute while it comes up.
Is because of the number of people we might otherwise exclude. On average, 1 in 5 people have a disability or impairment. The purple pound, the annual disposable income of disabled people, is $1 trillion globally. But by designing for different, we also factor in situational or temporary impairments which can inhibit anyone's ability to interact with digital services. The World Health Organization's definition of disability is a mismatch in interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they live. The great thing about us humans is we're all different. So how we interact with technology will be different too, whether we have a disability or not. That's why at Barclays, accessibility means ensuring that everyone can use our products and services or be employed by us. It's that simple. It's our ambition to be the most inclusive and accessible company in the FTSE 100. Great ambition, but surely what we offer is already easy for people to use. Well, that depends on your perspective. By designing based on our own abilities and perspectives, we create digital solutions that work for some, but unintentionally exclude others. User feedback shows our services can be frustrating or just not usable. By keeping a range of abilities and preferences in mind from concept to test, we can create a better product and experience for all. We did that for Keep and Barclays Mobile Banking, and both achieved kite marks for accessibility. This shows what we can do when we really design with difference in mind.
Great. So let's quickly talk about accessibility and how accessibility kind of drives innovation, right? One thing to remember is that accessibility problems of today are the mainstream breakthroughs of tomorrow. Let's give you a few examples of how this is true and how and why this is true, right? Let's take a few examples of technologies that have kind of started with accessibility in mind and now are like probably everywhere. Contrast minimums is one example, which is a low vision accessibility requirement. It's one nice way of looking at UIs for a lot of people, even without accessibility needs specifically. And let's also quickly talk about autocomplete, for example, right? So autocomplete kind of, we all use it all the time, right? Every message that we type on our smartphones kind of relies on autocomplete. When we are searching for things from Google, we kind of rely on autocomplete. But autocomplete also helps people with motor impairments kind of or enter text with a lot of ease, because the input modalities are limited, and what happens is autocomplete kind of makes it easier for people with motor impairments to input text. Now, do you see that? Like, this is kind of helpful for people with motor impairments, but is also used by everybody today. Okay, let's talk about another thing that we kind of use almost every day, at least some of us. How many of us use something like an Alexa or Google Assistant or Siri on our phone? Right? Right? So yes, these are very convenient. These help us, these give us the capability to get things done easily by just a command and so on. But these voice interfaces also make it very easy for people with visual and motor impairments to kind of interact with physical and electronic devices at home, and also kind of get the information that somebody wants, right? So if you take an example scenario of locking down a garage door, for example, right? how would I mean, just giving a voice command saying, Alexa, could you please lock my garage door, would make it very easy for somebody with a motor impairment to kind of get that done, right? There are other AI advances that are kind of really adding value to accessibility and even in general, right? Let's talk about auto captioning, for example. Like, I'm sure all of us at some point make use of those captions that we see on YouTube videos, right? And also, let's say we are in a public space and the TV is on mute, it's displaying something interesting. It may be the case that we read captions and kind of understand what what the video is talking about. The fact is that captions actually make it very easy for people who are deaf and hard of hearing to follow along what's spoken, right? Let me give you a more powerful and recent example that I've seen in this case, in this scenario. So Microsoft has recently introduced something called Presentation Translator into PowerPoint, and what this essentially does is as you speak, you can also have your whatever you speak translated into a few different languages. But the thing is, if you also set the destination language to English, you can also have your presentations live captioned so that if there is somebody in your audience who's deaf and hard of hearing, they might be able to participate on this as well, right? So the case was translation, and it's kind of widely used, right? And yes, we all are inspired by a lot of companies that are very successful, and like companies like Apple and so on, and they have had accessibility with them all the time, as their core value. And they're definitely benefiting from keeping this in mind from day one, right? Let's talk about, I mean, accessibility kind of also helps you enhance your brand as well, right? So for example, let's say you're trying to get your products designed well, for instance, and what this kind of results in is you're trying to make your products accessible, and this would result in good design. Good design will result in a lot of media attention and people kind of giving you a lot of positive press as well. And also, yes, your technology is designed well so that everybody, irrespective of ability, can use it, right? I'd say, if you do a quick Google search for Microsoft and accessibility, for example, you would see a lot of positive sentiment around Microsoft and everything that the company has been doing around accessibility, right? And accessibility kind of also, like thinking about accessibility kind of helps you also increase your market reach. There are a lot of people with disabilities, and there is countries with life expectancies over 70 years of age, and where people spend a lot of their time living with a disability, right? Now, given if your technology is kind of designed with disability in mind, yes, you're catering to all those audiences as well, which kind of implies an increased market reach. Now, next slide. Let me give you a case, example case of a podcast called NPR. So what happened is they were sued, they were hit with a legal lawsuit around accessibility. And as a result of that lawsuit, what they kind of did is they wanted to caption all their transcripts. Like they wanted to add transcripts to all their podcasts, right? So that to kind of evade this lawsuits. Sure, the lawsuit was probably evaded. But what they also got in addition to that is a lot of increased search traffic, because the content in the podcast was in text and kind of became searchable by all the search indexing software, right? And yes, having these transcripts also made the content and in return the podcast reachable to people for whom English was not their first language, right? So by not thinking about accessibility, businesses also kind of run into the legal risk, for example. Next slide. Yeah, legal risk, for example. There are laws which mandate accessibility of your services to some extent, and also there are penalties and other consequences that companies and actually even employees individually to some extent are liable for making sure their products and services are accessible. This is Indian law that I'm talking about, right? So the consequence of violations are there. So it's always good to kind of have the accessibility. So Karthik will kind of continue the presentation. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Venkatesh. So talking now about, so we talked about accessibility and why that was important. But now, once we talk about accessibility, the best people to be able to provide feedback are people with disabilities. But again, when you think about the employment of people with disabilities, we all know, and I'll get to this in a minute as well, it's alarmingly low right now. So I have a few points here which talk about why hire people with disabilities, right? So there are several research studies that show that on an average, the people with disabilities tend to be highly motivated, especially when you talk about certain disabilities, given certain nature of disabilities sometimes as well, they're really good at doing specific tasks really well as well. So given all of that, they've generally found the productivity to be higher, which is one crucial benefit, of course. And of course, the different perspective that they bring to the table. I'll go back to the personal assistant example that Venkatesh was talking about a minute ago, right? And there are so many scenarios. I work for Cortana, which is Microsoft's personal assistant, and there are so many scenarios where when you think about an average person using voice interface, they don't really understand that here is how these are the corner cases that we are not accounting for, right? Or that we are not factoring in while we are developing something. And then I go and say, well, I use voice interfaces 24/7, right? And this is one corner case that you do not think about. And they're like, oh yeah, this makes complete sense. And that in general makes the product better for everyone, right? So, and the same case with a bunch of other products as well. So bringing in that diverse perspective that more generally makes the product better is something that, again, hiring people with disabilities really helps with. And of course, again, let's talk business here. I understand a lot of people just, we all talk, money and the incentives that we get. So of course, there are also tax incentives that are available from the government of India if you have 5% of your workforce as people with disabilities. So there are also those incentives for employers to hire people with disabilities. On an app, also, if you think about the cost, right? For example, the time off costs and other expenses that the companies encourage, you also see that those costs actually get reduced when you hire people with disabilities. And you might see like a bunch of statistics here that kind of talk more about that. And again, as I said before, even in terms of productivity and performance reviews, there have been several studies that talk about how people with disabilities on an average receive higher ratings. Despite talking a lot about all of these benefits, we all know that that is not happening, and there's just a crazy amount of disparity between the number of people with disabilities that even have skills that are not being employed. So this is definitely a big problem. And some of the reasons that we see why companies do not hire. So of course, a lack of understanding of the abilities of people with disabilities. This is a constant problem that we run into. We don't even know how a blind person, for example, works. So then it's only correct to expect that the blind person will be able to code at all or do anything that is productive enough for the company. So I think lack of awareness is one of the most fundamental problems that a lot of the studies also conclude is a big issue. And also, of course, again, it comes back to what are the benefits that they're bringing to the table, and then the accommodations, right? So a lot of the companies think, if I hire someone who's blind, I probably have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to just get screen readers, and then they'll have 1,000 other softwares that I have to buy for them. How many of you, in the audience, and visually impaired participants will not reply to this. How many of you in the audience think that on an average, to accommodate a person with a disability would cost more than $1,000? Okay, so, well, that seems like a very intelligent audience.
Actually, I went to the next slide by mistake.
So as you see in the slide, you have some sense of the cost of accommodations, most commonly available accommodations, and you see 31% of accommodations cost nothing. Right? So it's about systems in place, it's about sensitization, it's about the attitude of people, it's about being receptive to everyone, being accepting is what really makes a difference, and really giving people an opportunity to provide their perspective, their unique perspective that they can then make the product in general much better and more accessible. So, okay, so we talked about, again, the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. I hope some of you are somewhat convinced by now, maybe? So, who's not convinced, by the way? I want to have a chat with that person after the session. Maybe over coffee or something. Yeah, who's an HR that is not yet convinced? Well, they would never say that. At least not here. So I think then let's get into some of the more useful, concrete things, right? Like how do we get started with this, right? And I think the very first step is acknowledging where you are, right? I mean, just as how companies, are not the best at everything, I think acknowledging where you are, where you need to go, acknowledging that all of us in general have a lot of work to do in terms of inclusion, in terms of providing accessible workplaces for people with disabilities. Just acknowledging that in itself is a big step, because then the moment you do that, you start working on the things that you're not good at, right? So that, I think, is the first step, the most important step, actually. And after that, let's talk about employ. This is the most basic thing that you can do. Include people with disabilities in your workforce. And again, not just at entry-level positions. It's important to have them, to help them think about their own career trajectories and think about how the companies can play, or the startups, small companies, mid-sized companies, what role they can play in furthering the career progression, the trajectory of that employee with disability as well. So thinking through that is also really important. And of course, thinking about recruitment in fresh ways, right? Because when you think about disabilities such as autism, for example, it's not fair, and there are a lot of studies that talk about this. It's just not fair to, for example, ask them behavioral questions. And of course, I understand that it's a spectrum that we're talking about here, and so this can really vary. So I don't want to make any generalizations here. But still, being mindful of certain limitations that come with certain disabilities, and then being open to new ways of assessing the same talent in a different way that takes into account their unique circumstances, being flexible about that is only right. And it's not just right for people with disabilities, it's right for any other employee that you might have. Like, at the end of the day, you don't just want to have them go through one set of interviews, which is common for everyone, and then someone who's just went over this 5,000-page interview book a night before, learned up all of the answers and come and ace the interview, and then you actually have him his job and he doesn't really do anything at all. I mean, we don't want such an employee, and no company wants that, of course, right? So looking at other ways, more interesting ways to try and assess the abilities, especially when it comes to employees with disabilities, since they might have special requirements or cases. So again, actionable tips here. I think it's important to designate a person, right? When you start off, it can be very overwhelming, but at the same time, having someone who's leading the effort is very extremely important. Someone who has the vision, someone who understands the overall picture and have a sense of where we want to go, and can then put in the various pieces together is super important. And also, not everything has to be figured out from the get-go. I don't think, honestly, there's any company in the world that has figured out the whole diversity and inclusion story right now, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about unemployment right now, right? So start small is important. It's not important to figure out everything. Make small steps. And of course, thinking about some hiring considerations are important. And I would specifically like to call out a few from a visual impairment perspective. So a lot of the challenges that, for example, people with visual impairment or other disabilities as well face are, simple inaccessibility issues with even the hiring portals. So, the resumes are also now going to go in. So thinking about that, for example, thinking about whether there's a central person again that the students or other potential hires can go to for accommodations, that's crucial. And then thinking about interview accessibility that I just talked about, making sure that we're catering interviews to the individual needs of students, whatever it takes to have them deliver and perform their absolute best so that we can give them a fair chance. That is super important. And again, being open to new ways is super important. I think change is critical, right? If you just get stuck on with the traditional ways, then nothing's going to happen, especially in the tech sector where things change overnight. So talking about enable, right? So how do you enable employees with disabilities? And I think this goes to senior leadership. It doesn't just come from HR taking a decision one day, oh, you know what, we want to just make our company inclusive because, oh, it's a fancy thing to do. It's going to get us media coverage. It doesn't work that way, right? It has to come from the top. Like, it has to be a vision, it has to be something the company genuinely cares about or wants to invest in, because then it's not just going to be one department that will be looking into this, right? The entire culture of the company is going to be centered around that, which is what is super important, because it doesn't make any sense if the person just comes in and then the person, we cannot retain the person, because the company is not inclusive, because people don't understand accessibility, people don't want to be receptive. So I think, again, it has to come from the top. It has to be multiple stakeholders, really getting involved right from the senior leadership in this process. And also, again, awareness programs for employees without disabilities. Hopefully, this hackathon is serving as as one such example right now, where we can try and at least bridge the gap between people with and without disabilities, and kind of show that the end product that both the communities produce is the same. It's just a matter of how that product is being developed. Again, organizing those trainings about tools and technologies can be very helpful for employees without disabilities. And of course, similar events as well that they can foster inclusion. So actionable tips here, I think again, organizing trainings, really creating a safe environment for employees with disabilities where they can disclose. One statistic that I would like to share is 90% of disabilities on college campuses are actually invisible, right? Like, there are disabilities like autism, and given the stereotype that exists today, especially associated with disability in our society, most of these people do not even disclose. So providing that environment where they feel safe, and they can go and have these sort of private, confidential discussions with people that they can trust, and that can then provide them suitable tools where they can do their best accounting for their disabilities is extremely important. And starting small, again, with the combination program, getting started somewhere, maybe taking a few disabilities first, and then approaching it that way. It can be very useful. And then internal tool accessibility. Oftentimes, people with disabilities run into issues where internal tools, since they do not have to necessarily go out to the public, there is little, if not no compliance with accessibility standards, and so employees have a very hard time working on these tools, working with these tools. So then looking into that as well, and doing more generally, just having that considered thought process around whatever I can do to make my company accessible is what is required.
That's where I've actually encountered a clash, but it's kind of interesting because we use picture messages for marketing communication. That's not super important, but how do you make a strong case there? And a lot of this is internal communication, that everyone is not image-based. We're not going to absorb this. I know it intuitively. Yeah. But is there some place where you have hard numbers or something?
Can I briefly answer that?
Sure.
So, as I mentioned in the morning, one of the things is that when you want to make a case for the image-based communication for the marketing channel, you should leverage on the mobile users. So, a lot of times we leverage on the mobile users, especially like executives. The images doesn't get loaded when you are previewing a message. So it just, like I said, when you are looking at marketing mailer on the mobile device, it just shows you cancelled records.
But nobody complains, because executives don't complain.
I mean, again, that is something which probably people may not have thought that, because if we try to, it's just about not giving a thought to something.
Yeah, I think I've seen a bit of that too, where again, it comes back to again the market, right? What is important to the company, and whether, especially in larger companies, right, where again, because people haven't really thought through a lot of this, and they almost, it's like we already know sort of is what the mindset is, right? That we already know this works, and this is how it works. That's it, done, right? Those conversations, of course, are always hard, which is why I was talking about like how one of the crucial steps towards inclusion is embracing change, which is probably one of the biggest deterrents, right? Which we see everywhere, which then of course stalls progress or whatever it is that you want to do. But yeah, I agree. Certainly not easy to have these discussions, but yeah, some places to start off and get these discussions started. So engage is the third step, which is thinking about ways in which employees without disabilities can also get involved. Again, this sensitizes the employees. Also, great again, volunteering opportunities, things in which they can give back to the society. So, looking into these programs as well, I think is again a step towards inclusion, which of course is not only helping your company but also externally as well. So that could be another great step towards thinking about this. And there are companies that have successfully done this, such as T-Mobile in the US, very successfully around, and using, for example, things like sport, that people can relate to. That also could be very interesting to look into. Things that people understand, things that are not hard to relate to, and stuff like that. And finally, empowering people with disabilities themselves through mentorship programs within the company, across maybe different companies. And again, being comfortable with the idea that people with disabilities do not have to be absorbed in specific career profiles, right? We've all been talking about how there's virtually no occupation in the world where people with disabilities today are not employed, right? And so being rigid about it and making our own assumptions and identifying jobs that work, jobs that don't work, probably not the best way to go forward. Being very open and really kind of seeing for ourselves on a very case-by-case basis the value that the person can bring and the skills that they have is the way to go. So, and also encouraging, of course, the employees to get integrated with their communities. In case employees with disabilities aren't necessarily integrated with the community, encouraging them to associate, to again find mentors, find people who might have done things, which of course make them better employees, but of course also is in the interest of the company at large. So, yeah. So that's pretty much what we had in terms of some of the ways to get started. Trying to make a business case for both product accessibility and having accessibility. And now we're going to get into a Q&A discussing. Of course, this is not supposed to be more of we answering. If you really want it to be the kind of discussion you were having just a moment ago, where people share their perspectives, their challenges. We have a bunch of visually impaired participants as well here, a bunch of HR professionals sharing their perspectives as well. So let's have the conversation started.
No, I found legislation to be incredibly useful in our case, because what happened was either a directive from the government, I'm forgetting which specific department, it said that your billing services need to be accessible. I got a call from regulatory. Can you test? Did that, I think they fixed it. So in the event you run an accessibility challenge, the Vodafone Idea app let me know.
This point also came up in the last session with a few of the cited participants. We were talking about, again, how do we become accessibility champions? And one of the things that's a challenge is, how do I get started, especially if my company does not care about accessibility? And we had a person share her perspective, and she was like, well, as much as we hate it, legal and compliance is probably the best way to get in. That's like the forceful sort of way to get in, and then kind of show them the business value as well. As much as I think, of course, no one here would like to sue a company for inaccessibility, but yeah, sometimes things do work that way. And then we've also had examples where that was a starting point, like how Venkatesh was talking about it in terms of podcasts, and how then they had transcripts, and how they realized the benefits later on, and now of course they do it, and accessibility is a core priority for them. So it's interesting to see like how things evolve from lawsuits.
So I'm not sure if it was discussed, but for the benefit of everybody, my name is Ankit, and I'm not sure if the timelines for services becoming accessible was discussed in the previous section, but the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 makes it amply clear that all services, and the definition of services is very vast today. It includes everything from banking, telecom, postal, information technology, every possible definition, and all that needs to become accessible by June of 2019. So that's a big timeline. It's a clock which is ticking away. Of course, enforcement in India could be a challenge, but then that gives us as people with disabilities, well-wishers of disability, to fight and perhaps even demand a right to get accessible solutions. But Ankit, to be very honest, this Balaji here, for example, our own people who are working in corporates as representatives who are actually in hiring positions, they are not able to convince their own organizations. Okay, how do we handle this? We do have some people who are visually impaired who are actually settled in corporates. Yes. And they are the ones who should actually be, they'll be in a better position to talk to the people and then convince them saying that yes, these are the advantages that come in when you take a person with a disability. But ironically, if you really see, if I'm a visually impaired person, if I have to get a job, I should be super intelligent. I should be somebody like Karthik, otherwise I don't get a job.
That's not true.
And if I have this disability, I do not stand a chance. How do we empower these people who are at these positions to actually start it from there? As an outsider, I cannot do anything about it. But I do feel that people who are in those positions where they can bring about a change, they should be in a position to do this. And we should see what needs to be done to empower them to do so.
Okay, so I have a slightly different perspective. What happens typically, and I apologize to HR professionals in advance, they know very little of what actually happens in business. So there isn't too much, they usually are not able to speak to business on its own terms. So the convincing has to be of the hiring manager, the business project manager. Because at least in a large company, and I guess this may vary from company to company, but there is a massive disconnect between HR and business. HR will do its own function, business will do what it has to do. The twain will meet when recruitment is required or if there is some process connect or a problem. So the problem I think is twofold. One, how do we convince line staff or whatever you want to call them, actual people who work to see people with disabilities, and secondly, how do you convince HR to say that okay, it's not such a huge problem, because that was another discussion we had in the morning. Right? Yeah, you can bring in compliance, and that's why you're seeing a backlash against some of these ADA suits now.
I think,
you like it, you don't like it, the rules are going to be there, and I think which is a positive thing for us. But just going back to the discussion on how do you convince your the business or the operations managers as far as employment is concerned, and I think by showcasing real good case studies in similar scenarios. Now, if I go back to my own case study, when I joined the workforce in 2006, there wasn't really a reference point in IT industry of a blind person joining a mainstream operations role or a BPO role or whatever. So nobody wanted to take me in. I was on bench for 6 months. But only when I got a chance and I proved it that I can do it for them is when people started looking into it, and then they started hiring more of them. So I think when we come across these managers who are not really aware of it, I think really a first ice could be broken by showcasing successful case studies, and that's what we need to really create a bouquet of these case in points where people, marketing, HR, maybe across spectrum of work that they've done, and we need to showcase them that they are able to do productively without any compromises. I think that's important. Of course, it's a constant conversation. There's never, you talk to them today and there's a magic wand which has got created and people are, voila, that they're hiring. So that doesn't happen that way. You have to be persistent with them. And when we as people with disability or people from our own community who are working, I think they themselves are a good brand ambassador. We also need to start talking a little more with a lot more assertion and stop belittling ourselves. Perhaps there's still a lot more stigma and we don't come out enough with confidence that yes, we are an equal part and not a lesser part. I think when you talk with that assertion, people do listen, and I think it's a process. There are times when people may just start hiring sooner. There are times when organization needs to set a good process in itself. Only then it becomes a lot more sustainable. So it's a process, and we need to be participating in the whole dialogue.
And I want to add something to this conversation. My name is Kajal. I agree to what he said, that the HR really don't know what is happening within the business. We agree, we don't. But that is what needs to change. It has to come as, like, within the organization, if we look forward and we have a vision to hire people with disability, it has to come from everywhere. It should be a partnership between the business and the HR and the leadership team to see which kind of business can hire what kind of disabilities, right? There are different disabilities that we see, we have currently. We're not saying that we are only talking about one disability at this point of time. But each job may be able to, accommodate a different disability at that point of time. And that is what I think needs to be worked on as an organization for all of us, is what I would say.
To just a quick comment on that, I think it's also important to realize, though, that, again, no amount of awareness or reading will basically help us conclude whether a particular person with a particular disability will be able to do justice to a particular job profile, right? I think it's also really, I think the need of the hour is to, again, give people a chance, whether that is through internships, whether that is through different interview processes, whatever it takes, being like, yeah, sure, I don't understand this, right? Being upfront about it, right? I don't understand this disability, and which of course I agree that most people here, even with disabilities, we don't understand all disabilities, do we? Do we understand anything beyond visual impairment as well? We probably don't, right? Yeah, not enough, right? So I think being open about that, being realistic about, like, yeah, sure, I don't understand. I want to go and see what happens, taking it as an experiment and seeing where you go with it, I think is also something that we should all be up for.
I think I would add something to it.
Yeah.
So, as like you rightly said, it happens, and when it comes to identification, that has that is something which can backfire at times, and which does also. So, our dear government actually came out with that formula, and they started identifying jobs, and they identified, like, okay, when it comes to, and of course, as Karthik said, unless or until we don't give anybody a chance to do something, we are not aware that, okay, that can also be done. So for people with vision impairment, they used to identify only telephone operators jobs, and they later on then they realized, okay, they are good at typing also, so they realized, okay, stenography and typing, that's how it used to be. And then those works, when those became redundant, a lot of people also became redundant. Why? Because they were not aware that they can be given computers. So people used to say that, I'm good at computers, but the management did not have much thought about it. And they said, okay, the job which is identified for you will take you against only that kind of a role. So, what I would say, scenario keeps on changing every single minute. And with a thing which is not accessible today, or if you say that a person with vision impairment may not be able to deal with graphs today, which precisely is the case. Like it's actually difficult to deal with images and graphs and stuff, so you definitely can't have that person for a role which is like graphic designing or which is very intensive visually. But identifying that specifically is not the way to go forward. Why? Because probably after 2 years the situation will change. And to incorporate that, the revised situation in a larger company environment becomes extremely difficult.
Do we have any startup founders here who would like to share anything? Anyone who is into a mid-sized company, any challenges that you face, or what are your thoughts? Do you have anyone?
I'll give you a startup story.
Okay, go for it. Go for it.
I go into a startup, this is early 2005, and what I'm told is, I'm not even buying the tools we need to do our business. Why should I pay for JAWS for Windows?
Did it really happen?
This happened. I kid you not.
Yeah. So I think that That was a very interesting discussion, and we'll obviously continue discussions. All of us are here over the next 2 days. Hopefully, this will be a platform where we can take discussions forward. And now I think we'll give over.
I'll take this opportunity to invite somebody to share his views. The somebody is Mr. Prateek, who is the CEO for the accelerator that has been floated by Samarthana. It focuses on companies which work with accessible technologies. And for the kind of discussion that we're having today, I think his views become very relevant for us. So Prateek, if you could share your views.
Okay, thank you, Mudga. I'll just take few time. I have been in the industry for last 20 years and in disability last 10 years. So while all of you start thinking that I'm too old, I'm not. I did it in parallel. Yeah. So the Samatana is an organization most of you or some of you would know. Samatana is 22-year a young organization, field of disability. It's an inclusive organization where we have projects in education, livelihood. We also run Indian blind cricket team. I'm sure all of you in India, I'm told only two things matter, Bollywood and cricket. So we also run...
I got coaching from the coaches there.
Okay, great.
So Shekhar Nayak and all.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So Shekhar Nayak used to be our captain for Indian blind cricket team, and he won us 2 World Cups. So India,
2020 and 2014 ODI.
Yeah, so some of them organized these 2 World Cups for cricket. Indians are current champions, beating Pakistan in final in all formats of. I think sometimes I get more claps when I say when we beat Pakistan in final than I say when we are the world champions. Right? Anyway, coming back to the topic, but thank you. I'll just quickly share what ATA is all about. So ATA is Assistive Technology Accelerator. My personal experience is working with a lot of startups in assistive technology and a lot of corporate technology labs. Is that some of you are founders of this organization. You can probably add on to it or provide your views. So I think these startups face 2 kinds of challenges. One is the typical startup challenges, right, which is funding issues. Issues like product market fit. I met a lot of kids who are brilliant in technology. They are people in Koramangala flat, 4 of them housing for months, and they come to Samatana and say, we have invented or we have innovated a brilliant product. I said, it looks like a product, brilliant or not, we'll figure it out. And we have some of our people with disability in Samatana test it out, and they often we have experienced that these products don't work. So, I'm just going to repeat the startup part. So, one, funding issues we've seen. Second, the product market fit. The third challenge is also very real, where some of these good products are being made, but they don't have any way to distribute these products, right? And I think probably conferences or hackathons like this, you will get to hear a lot about products which are available. But that's only one set of challenges. The other set of challenges which we have seen is some of these tech founders do not know disability, isn't it, Karthik? I'm sure you would have seen a lot of people, because disability per se is a very wide, deep field, and you have to have somebody, person with disability in your team, or a super user whom you should be consulting with, right? And some of these products come out, being waste of time, energy, and effort, just because they did not consult, any person with disability. What ATA aims to do is to really help some of these startups scale. So we have looked at, in past few months, around 60 plus assistive technology startups. We selected 3 of them as a part of our first cohort. What ATA offers is a suite of resources. So we work very closely with number of venture capitalist companies. I'm trying to talk to a lot of them in the industry to excite them and tell them this is also an area where they can potentially put their money on. We work very closely with government because the distribution can be done if we can excite government on the technology which some of the startups have developed. We work with a lot of tech labs because a lot of technology which you guys would need or what startups guys need is available with the companies like Accenture. That's where I worked last, right? So we invest a lot in the latest and greatest technologies and something that can be made available to some of these startups. We work with a lot of disabled beneficiaries through Samarthanam, a number of organizations like Samarthanam, and several others. So all that ecosystem is being made to available for all these startups who are going to be accelerated by ATA. So I'm just going to end with that. Yeah. Any questions?
On cricket, do you validate product ideas?
When you say validate, what kind of validate? In a pilot stage?
Yeah, a startup founder comes to you with a prototype and says, hey, look, I have this, but is this a viable or a useful concept?
So we could help, not as a part of ADA, but we have resources where we can help that with. But the essential thought of ATA, it being an accelerator, it's not an incubator. So incubator probably would do more of an idea to pilot, validation. But we are interested in accelerating or scaling up companies because we have seen a number of solutions or startup coming up in assistive tech space. We haven't seen any of them scale. So everybody is talking about few thousands of customers, paid or non-paid, but I think in my experience, not a lot of startups are talking about numbers of thousands of, a few lakhs or a million of customers, which is actually the market available to them, right? So to answer your question, I mean, yes and no. Yes, because we can help with our resources, but probably no, because we won't be able to take companies which are at an incubation state in ATA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to expand to that question, in what stage do you take companies?
So companies who have some customers, some product market fit validation that is being done. If they've got funded, it could be seed funding, which means they've reached a state where they have some product to offer, which is deployable. We will help them with the market access anyways. So those kind of companies is what we are looking for. And we will help them connecting with a lot of VCs once they are ready for that stage, for a pre-Series A or a Series A round. Okay, thank you folks. Thanks for your time.